Moderator, the floor is yours.
Hi, so I'm Susan Landau, and the panel is I'm speaking, then Bill Yurchik, and then we'll do a panel. And so let me hit start so I stay on time. So for me, as I think for many of you, Ross was a force of nature. And the thing about forces of nature is that they're either a gale force wind or a stream that becomes a river when the ice melts and it takes down everything in its path, but it also creates new vistas. And you can be the person who sees the new vistas. You could be the person whose farmhouse and home gets knocked down, and you could be the person who both of those things happen to. And for some of us, Ross was one, and for some of us, Ross was the other, and for many of us, Ross was both. When I first met Ross, I don't actually remember, it was lost in the sands of time somewhere in Crypto 1. I was writing a book with Dippy on encryption policy. By Crypto 2, we had become co-authors. And what I learned about Ross was that strategy was part of what he thought about, but strategy was not the biggest part of Ross. The biggest part of Ross was social justice. And that overwhelmed him every single time. And it was great for all of us. Working with Ross was challenging. It was intellectually challenging because he had exciting ideas. He had social struggle was also always part of it. You would think that you were working along on some piece of technical stuff and Ross would bring in some social aspect of it, and you knew he was right, but you wanted to go this way, but he insisted that you also do that way, and now all of a sudden you had to do both pieces, and there was more than periodic exhaustion. Had to do all things at once, and that was characteristic of how Ross did his research, was that he was doing all sorts of things at once. It wasn't just encryption algorithms, it was also security and security protocols, and also we had to look at the policy and all the implications of the policy. And maybe also we needed to have an organization to take care of getting the policy out there. Which brings me to Ross did all these organizations. So first of all, when I first knew Ross, encryption was at Crypto. And Crypto was a great meeting. The strawberries dipped in chocolate were terrific. The shrimp was terrific. I think many people, including Bruce and me, came for both of those, and the technical talks were fine, but it was really but Crypto was very theoretical. And Ross knew that encryption doesn't go just by theory. And so Ross started fast software encryption. But he also started with Casper Bowden and others, FIPR. And so that was part of Ross. And then Ross realized, of course, that cybersecurity is not just a technical problem. And he went and spent a semester at Google, and he and Hal Varian started workshop in WISE. Blah, blah, blah. I know what WISE is. But here's the problem about WISE, workshop in the economics of information security. Here's the problem about WISE. The economists publish in one set of ways. The computer scientists publish in conferences. What do? The economists do not publish in conferences. Well, if you're a computer scientist or you're an economist, you say, oh, this is too hard, we can't do it. And if you're Ross, you say, we'll make it not a publishing conference, and they'll go publish where they ought to. And that was what Ross always did. There was a problem, he figured a unique way to get out of it and make things work. The other thing that Ross did, he pulled in people. He pulled in Tyler and Rayner, and all various people into to running WISE. He pulled in Bruce into running WISE and SHIB. Ross kept pulling in people. I watched these graduate students and I thought, oh God, these graduate students are getting overworked. What is Ross doing to them? These graduate students were getting overworked, and they were getting introduced to colleagues at a junior age, and they were getting to work with colleagues at a junior age, and Ross was right, yet again. That part of not doing things by himself, as people said, Ross built community, but he built community also and engaged the younger people and brought them in at a really young age and did really great things for them. Ross focused broadly. I came from mathematics, where the field of mathematics, if you're lucky, you get 12 citations on a paper. Maybe 6 people in the world can understand the work you did. This is not true, by the way, at NSA. One of the recruiting lines at NSA is you'll have a whole community of people interested in your work and they can actually read it. But Ross refused to function in that narrow way. Ross insisted on working broadly. Maybe you can't get as deep when you work broadly, but you solve much bigger problems. And that was something that Ross not only did for himself, but he taught the rest of us as well. And yes, sometimes you reinvent the wheel when you do that. And you piss people off when you reinvent the wheel. But if you reinvent the wheel and throw new things into it, you're really seeding things in a very useful way intellectually, and that was part of Ross. Ross and women. So I arrived at encryption having come from a PhD in research in theoretical computer science. And what we do in theoretical computer science is mathematics, and you don't move forward until you've done this piece, and then you do the next piece, and then you do the next piece. I walked into this den of cryptographers as I was doing the book with Whit, and they're noisy, aggressive, type A to the nth, and I'm a mathematician come computer scientist, and I'm female, and there are very few of us in the room. Even today, there are very few of us in the room, but there were even fewer then. And Ross, well, Whit took up a lot of room, Ross took up a lot of room. I'd learned to work with Whit, but it was a little bit intimidating. And I had to learn how to do this. And over time, I learned how to do this, and I worked with Ross, and Ross and I did papers together. I learned to argue with Ross. Ross learned to have women in the room and learned to do that. I actually credit Alice Hutchins with a lot of this. I think that Ross changed in the 2000s, and certainly in the 2010s. And he became really energetic and enthusiastic about having women. And here I want to say that at one point, Ross sent me an email, and he said, you got to read Crash Override. It's about misogyny, homophobia, and toxic masculinity and how they drove Gamergate. We should listen to the actual victims rather than just other academics. This was a huge change for Ross. All of us, some of us learned to change, many of us do not. And I became much better friends with Ross as this happened. So it was not just, of course, Ross changing, it was also me changing. And it says a lot about the integrity and wholeness of a person that they can do that. Many of us can't. And so, when I thought about talking here, and I thought about all the different aspects of Ross, I thought about how much he gave to all of us, how much he built community, how much he changed, how much he cared about social justice, and how much that informed his research. And I want to end by saying, Ross had a tremendous love of the world. He adored Shireen, and he had a tremendous love of the world, and that came through in everything he did. Thank you.
Very good. Hello, my name is Bill Yurchek. I work for the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services in the United States. I'm a federal employee, but I must say, this is on tape, I'm not speaking for the federal government. Okay, so this is me. I made my own schedule. This is on my dime. I came here because I felt obligated to represent what Ross did to healthcare worldwide. So I first want to speak to the family because I know right now you might gather strength from all of us being here, but I know it's at some point we won't be here, and I hope the memories, the things we speak here, will give you memories that will give you strength in the future. Okay. So what is it about, why am I on a panel? This is a panel on policy. So the contributions that Ross did with healthcare is a little bit different because it really wasn't basic research, it was more applied research. And it like I said, it affected worldwide. I'm in the United States, and I'll give some interplay between the United States. In his literature, there's a lot of things related to Iceland. He was a consultant that Iceland did we'll talk about national databases, Germany, Austria, New Zealand. So the paper is in the document that you can read, so I'm not going to really go through that. I'm going to just highlight 3 points, so you can be sure I'll try to make my points brief. So, well, how did I personally meet Ross? So you can tell by my beard, I've been around a while. I met him at the first several workshop on economics and information systems, and I was a graduate student at that time. And he was nice enough to mentor me. And then 25 years later, almost exactly the same time, after it was about 10 years, there was a workshop on healthcare the cybersecurity and healthcare that Unix had been running in like 2005 to 2015. I know one of my colleagues, Carl Gunther at the University of Illinois, was involved with it. It lapsed. But with everything happening, I saw an opportunity to have another workshop. So I was talking to Ross, and he wanted to participate. I don't see John McHughes here. John has a very personal relationship with Ross, and I said, Ross, maybe you don't have to attend. Can you contribute? And then I didn't hear back, and that's when we lost him a year ago. So that's my personal connection. So let me go on a little bit about technology and policy. So for Ross, you really can't separate the technology and policy, and hopefully I'll demonstrate that in his career, because his earliest work was in threat modeling. This is when it's unclear for me whether it's a time where he was a graduate student or early professorship, but he was doing work on security of healthcare systems, and he noticed the implications. So he began looking at threat modeling, and he says, wow, geez, what are the threats? So one of the things he came up with was the threats he found out in the national healthcare system in the UK. They did empirical studies and found out about most of his is loss of data accidental. About particularly lost laptops that provided access to the system, but 5 times as many were lost accidentally as were maliciously stolen. So that's important if you're going to do security and privacy to understand what the threats are. He also found that the threats were abuse from insiders, not from outsiders trying to attack the system. And that's another way, if you're going to design a system, it's good to know. So an analogy in the United States, we had sort of similar in 2006, probably the most famous was the VA system had about the Veterans Administration for all the former people in the military in the United States had a CD that had 2.5 million people's information on that was lost. So that was a major change point. From that point on, in the United States, all federal systems had to be encrypted data at rest. So it's about the same time that the national healthcare system was forming here. So around that, I can't tell you the dates here because I'm not a UK citizen, but Tony Blair was the president around the time as Bill Clinton, and they had a gigantic, what's that?
Prime Minister.
Prime Minister, what did I say? President, okay, oh, sorry, yeah.
At
So,
least you didn't say king.
yeah, king. No, we have a king in the States, so that's why I forgot that. So about that time, like one of the largest projects ever in the world was there was a program for IT for the national health system where they wanted to make a standard database, a centralized database. And that same discussion was happening in the States. At that time, President Clinton, his wife Hillary, was a senator, and she was trying to do essentially the same thing. So Ross was involved in discussions, and I was peripheral around this time. That one of the things is if you have a centralized database of all information, okay, the value, the risk associated with that is associated to the value of the data plus the number of people having access to it. So the risk of a centralized database, it could be attacked and essentially compromised. He says, we got to have another way to go. So he championed here in the UK. You talk about general practitioners. In the United States, we call them primary care physicians. That they should have control locally, sort of like you have a personal relationship with your doctor. So that really that model of not having a centralized database was really influential around the world. And of course, he had. I mentioned Iceland. That was his contribution around the world with all these other countries. That one of the things, to go into the details a little bit, is that there's an idea of anonymization. That if you take certain characteristics out of the data, that everything's anonymized, or maybe put pseudonyms in. But like in my experience, there's always linkable data that you can take an outside data set and link it with maybe something that might be anonymized individually in isolation, but if you link it. And Ross continually took supposedly unbreakable, isolated databases and linked it and showed that it was not secure. So a lot at this time, I noticed in the document we have here is a really nice bibliography, and I looked at it. One of the things Ross did was publish a lot in the mass media. So I don't know what the Guardian is, I guess one of the top newspapers here. In the United States, we call them op-eds. Like the Washington Post and New York Times would have an editorial page. Well, there's quite a few op-eds from the Guardian. If you Google, you'll see Ross Anderson. He must have at least, I don't know, 20 to 30 op-eds that talk about this. So not only was he engaged technically, but he was engaged with the legislature. He had, with his policy advocacy, but he's involved in the mass media. And of course, he had students who he was mentoring here at the university all at the same time. So I'm mentioning the interplay between the United States, which I'm familiar with, and the UK. The United States does not have a nationalized health system, so we have a patchwork of different privacy. You really have to go into the weeds to understand how it operates. In the UK, the Guardian published an article about doctors that were, abused their authority, that were looking up information. And the same thing happened in the United States about that same time in Massachusetts, where a doctor misused his abuse and looked up people's information. And the senator at that time was Senator Edward Kennedy, the brother of John F. Kennedy. And he put forth in 1996 the HIPAA rule, which you probably heard of, the Health Information Portability Accountability Act. So it's sort of similar that some of the things that Ross did related to the national health system breaches was directly emulated, a mirror image in the United States at that time. Okay, so 3 points. One is trust. You have to have trust in the data. If you don't have trust in your healthcare system, you're not going to use it. So my organization where I work now has done studies of, let's say, people that have HIV or people have mental health issues do not use healthcare if they don't have trust that their data is going to be protected. And there's numbers on that. It's significant. It's in the millions of people that would not seek it. So Ross came up with a way to simplify how to talk about building trust. And it's really the database. It came up with what's known as the Anderson rule. I'll read it so I don't mess it up. Healthcare data, the integrity is let me see. Okay, data, healthcare integrity, to handle sensitive information, has a trilemma. There's 3 components: security, functionality, and scale. But of those 3, you can only choose 2. So that made it simple to talk about. This is, of course, if you take a database course, there's analytics behind this. But it made it simple that he could talk about it like a system that has a lot of people in the system, a lot of people accessing the system, that you can't, if you're going to have security, you have to cut the functionality down. You can't have very precise searches. On the other hand, if you have a lot of functionality, if you want to have security, you have to cut the number of people in the system or cut the access to the system. So it made it intuitive for people that are designing systems. And then the last point related to healthcare data is consent. And I was just talking to people who have used the healthcare system in the UK just recently, and there isn't a centralized database. It's distributed around general practitioners, but you have to give active consent. You probably heard of, in many things in life, you have to have, like, for say, if you're an organ donor, you have to opt in or opt out. He didn't like that. He wanted to be active. Whatever you're going to do, by default, you don't want to have your decision made by default. You have to be active about it, and you have to say, I want to opt in or I want to opt out actively. There's no way you can have just by default assign what you're going to do with your data. And I just verified on discussions that, like, here in the UK, they're actively doing that. So if you're, they're all involved in healthcare at some point in their life, and I'm thinking that when next time you go to your doctor in the United States, you have to sign off a lot of HIPAA forms. Here, you have an inquiry about how you want to use your data. So I could go on further, but I'm going to stop now because we have a distinguished panel. And I just want to say a few words in ending. Like the litany of professional accomplishments is impressive, but a person's more than his accomplishments. In fact, Ross touched all of us, else we wouldn't be here. It's because of relationships. I think John McHugh said possibly, and I would say strongly, that Ross's biggest contribution is the relationships he's formed, particularly personal relationships, else we wouldn't be here. And of course, this would not have been possible without his spouse, his lifelong partner, Shireen, and his loving family. And I think you're all partners. This is an accomplishment of not just Ross, but he wouldn't be able to do this without you, okay? But for all of us, Ross was a very social person, and he lived a life well lived. And I think we should all think that we played a part in helping make Ross the way he was, so we can all celebrate that we were part of helping Ross live a life well lived. So with that, I'd like to end, and we can ask questions more about healthcare. I sort of just covered the surface.
And now we'll move to the panel, and we'll start with Marie.
Do you want us to stand?
Sorry?
Do you want us to stand for the panel or not? There's a panel.
Your choice.
Okay.
You can stand on the stool, you can do whatever you want.
I will sit on the stool and not stand on it, but yes. Hi, I'm Marie Basic. I'm a lecturer in the Information Security Group at UCL. Ross is my academic grandfather via my PhD advisor, Tyler. And that's how I first met Ross, is via his papers. So when Tyler enticed me to be a PhD student of his, he gave me this big fat sack of papers. I then proceeded to read all of them and every other paper that Tyler had ever written, and decided to do my PhD with him. And it was really those ideas in the papers that made me want to do research. I had done research in other fields, more theoretical, but I really liked the practicality of the work and how it seemed to express things that I could see in real life. I first met Ross in Weiss in 2013 when it was in Washington, D.C., hosted Georgetown. I remember being so intimidated because I had heard all of these stories from Tyler, and I had read all of these papers, read the book, and I couldn't talk to him. And the most impactful thing actually came from not Ross, but actually his wife, Shireen, who came up to me as this grad student who said that, like, oh, you know, it's okay to talk to him. And that was really impactful. Ross was always a big person in my life, not so much directly, as I didn't work with him that much directly, but over the years I came up to Cambridge and gave talks, and since moving to UCL in 2019, he really encouraged me to move to the UK. I knew I wanted to leave my old job, and I had just a few brief emails, and he was like, yes, you really should come to the UK. We would love to have you here. And that was actually quite a big help that I should move here, not somewhere else. And ever since, I show up in the security lab every time to time, bring my students here to hear, among other things, some of the ideas of Ross. Now, the thing I really loved about Ross is his idea to see ideas not for how they were sold, but for how they worked. And he was really good at looking at really complex things and seeing what the narrow mechanism was. And I always respected that. He did that through his blog in conferences. He was great at not seeing the ideas for what the author's written, but rather what actually the main idea was. And he was also quite good at doing that for my papers, because I remember giving my first talk in Cambridge when I was like a second, third year PhD student, and he was very kind and very gentle, and we had over an hour-long conversation in his office about it, where he not only tore it apart, but also gave me new ideas for other things to work on. It was both in kind, and that was really my relationship with Ross over the years. He would always tear it apart and then also give me ideas for other things that I could work on. Now, I have a paper in the Festschrift about policy. It's really thinking about how when technologists design or write software, that often when they make things that they call technological ideas, that they are actually indeed making policy, even if inadvertent. And one of the key ideas in the paper is thinking about this in terms of like cryptocurrency exchanges. Before there was regulation, they self-regulated, and now there's current regulation that's really informed by the self-regulation phase. And it's an idea that I had talked with quite a bit with some of my students, but also with Ross over the years, and I think he would have really appreciated it. There was also another bit about looking at gender on social media and thinking about how social media companies allowed us to express gender beyond a gender binary, way before it was ever in any sort of policy. And this is definitely something that I would not have talked to Ross about, because we definitely would have butted heads, which is also why it's a lovely compliment in the paper. I hope you check it out. Thank you.
Stephen Murdoch, who I think probably will also not stand on the stool.
Okay, yeah, thanks everyone, and thanks for the invitation. So I've worked with Ross in several research topics, and some of these have caused a bit of controversy. So we've worked on censorship monitoring, trying to find out what governments don't want you to see. We've looked at censorship resistance, which is trying to get people to see that material. And we've worked in banking security, trying to address vulnerabilities in the banking system and protect the victims of crime. So on one hand, we've been taking on powerful nation states. On the other hand, we've been taking on the financial industry. But when it comes down to it, it's the financial industry who've been most aggressive at trying to get us to shut up. And Ross has worked to try to do research because it's important, even if this is research that other people are not willing to do because they think it's taking too much risk. So he's been taking risks, but this has always been carefully calculated. He's very conscious about whether research was ethical, thought carefully through the legal implications of doing this research. But of course he didn't do all of this himself. We've heard how he managed to enthuse other people to follow his practices and conduct research on these topics. And that's not just through contagious enthusiasm, although that's part of it. Some of it is because we always knew as junior researchers working with him that he would have our back if something went wrong. So we were able to do these research topics despite there being controversy. They might not have been the most fashionable topics at the time, although many of them turned out to be very important later on. Some of the things that Ross did to allow this to happen was to plan in advance. So he'd find the right lawyers to talk to, not the ones that say that everything is terrible, but the ones that you can have sensible conversations with. He'd ask the right questions. So how should we do this research safely, rather than are there any risks in doing this research? Because of course there's risks in doing any of this research, but those risks can be managed. And then there was also building up the networks of people and organizations who could help. So the financial industry might not care so much about academics. They've got more than enough lawyers to throw at us. But what they do care about are regulators, and they care about their media appearance. So we work with journalists, we work with regulators to make sure that if things went wrong, we would be able to shift the balance of power back in our direction. And almost all that the time, that was enough. The FRSE problems never happened because of the planning that did go on. But we knew that if something did become complicated, then Ross would be there. And we've heard how he can sometimes be intimidating to research collaborators, but you haven't seen him be intimidating to someone who's trying to shut up his researchers. and that happened. So the banking industry wrote to the University of Cambridge and asked for a master's thesis to be taken down and a blog post to be censored on the blog that I maintained. So I'll conclude by giving a quote from the letter he said in response. You seem to think that we might censor a student's thesis, which is lawful and already in the public domain, simply because a powerful interest finds it inconvenient. This shows a deep misconception of what universities are and how we work. Cambridge is the University of Erasmus, of Newton, of Darwin. Censoring writings that offend the powerful is offensive to our deepest values. Accordingly, I've authorised the thesis to be issued as a computer laboratory technical report. This will make it easier for people to find and to cite, and will ensure that its presence on our website is permanent.
Over the last year, I have often said, "Where is Ross when we need him?" But as I hear that quote, and I think about what happened in the United States last week, where the hell is Ross? Lawrence. And so now we'll hear from somebody who was recently a student and had Ross's protection and back, and his back.
Hi, I'm Yakuran Piao. You could also call me Lawrence. I'm a PhD student at the University of Edinburgh, where Ross was my primary supervisor. Compared to many of you, our time together was shorter, but I also learned a great deal from him. I first contacted and met Ross at the end of 2022. Because I wanted to apply a PhD in security economics. Ross's erudition and rich experience finally led me to decide to study at University of Edinburgh. A few months before I arrived in the UK, Ross had already started sharing papers and resources with me, and invited me to join the group meetings to help me adapt to my PhD studies. He also gave me many suggestions about living here, from accommodation to culture. We kept frequent communication from the beginning. After talking with other students, I realized that not every supervisor does this. Of course, every supervisor has their own style, but I'm truly grateful for his care and support. In Edinburgh, Ross was one of the most respected professors, and his interaction on both faculty and students left a lasting impact. He taught a course on security engineering there, and I was the TA for it. During the last spring, Ross would come to Edinburgh to teach in person every 1 or 2 weeks. Rather than lecturing from the textbook and the slides, he preferred engaging students in discussions and answering questions, encouraging them to think for themselves. Ross's guidance on my research centered around vulnerability disclosure and the vulnerability markets. He was very interested in these topics, especially in protecting researchers, as Stephen just said. Ross believed that the legitimate scholarly work should not be yielded to power, and that responsible disclosure should not be suppressed. This reflects the values he advocated, academic freedom and the necessity of security information disclosure. Prohibiting the discussion of vulnerabilities is not the way forward. It only hinders the progress of science and engineering. Additionally, he found that due to the growth of open source projects and supply chains, the coordinated disclosure and patching have become increasingly complex, especially with the introduction of AI components. Given the differing culture and technologies across the industry, he believed a better coordination will be a lengthy process. As one of the published work after his passing, there is a paper we co-authored on Chinese bug bounty ecosystem and bug hunter collaboration, which will be presented at Oakland in May. Finally, our paper in the Festschrift also focuses on protecting researchers. You may want to read it if you are interested. We explored the public discourse on the legal risks related to vulnerability research, especially for would-be security researchers and hackers. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Awais Rashid. I am Professor of Cybersecurity at the University of Bristol. Compared to a number of people who are speaking here, my collaborative work with Ross was much more recent. I met him over the years at conferences, and I would also say we didn't know each other very, very well. We would just kind of see each other. I was certainly at the receiving end of one of his, critiques, shall we say, when I was speaking. And I think George Davis is in the room. Both George and I were, but George hid in the back and let me receive all of it. So thank you, George, for that. And I've been sort of trying to rack my brain as to where and how we started to discuss more. And I think sort of, as part of the work that I was doing, I was thinking about building a privacy testbed where we wanted to test privacy properties of applications. And one of the ideas that we had was that we were going to look at end-to-end encrypted messaging applications and what kind of metadata and other information they may leak. And I don't know where and how. I must have mentioned this to Ross, and he had a student who was looking at doing some TLS interception, and some other people, and actually Jenny and Nicholas are in the room, and Partha from Bristol is in the room. We just kind of ended up talking more and more and more. And Ross was coming to Bristol for a workshop, which I'm sure Partha is going to talk about later when he speaks. And we talked about the fact, how about we got a few people together separately on the side to investigate what happens with regards to things like Signal and WhatsApp, which also last night I was actually thinking about, and I was saying this to some people earlier, what would he make of what was revealed last night by the Atlantic? And I quite expressly remember we spent kind of most of our day in this other workshop, and the students and postdocs were looking at investigating these end-to-end encrypted applications, and they found something. And what really both surprised me and excited me was this almost childlike enthusiasm, when we found that, okay, Signal is storing the keys, non-encrypted right next to the database, and you can actually clone the desktop and compromise forward secrecy and so on. He was thrilled. This is someone who had done so much, and he was actually excited. He wanted to know more detail, and we ended up kind of talking a lot more. We ended up investigating more together, and ultimately writing a paper about it. And he was really keen to ensure, this was at the time of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and he was really keen to ensure that the organizations involved did the right thing, and was also both flustered and annoyed, and in his usual mode, quite vocal about when they didn't want to do the right thing. And I think for me, that has always been kind of, my sort of memory of him is this excitement, this childlike excitement about research, having accomplished so much, and be willing to get involved in the nitty-gritty of things. And I think that's something that I certainly did admire a lot. And I was wondering last night. I had dinner with Partha, and I went back to my room, and then my phone buzzed and the Atlantic message came through, and I actually started to think, well, wonder if any of these people have linked their Signal messaging app to their home desktop client, and the kind of vulnerabilities that reveals, and whether Ross would publish on his blog about all of this if he were with us. that brings me to the paper in the Festschrift volume. It is certainly a controversial topic and something that I thought I would certainly talk to him about. So I'm leading a program of work on securing large-scale infrastructures. And again, when Ross came to our lab, he was super excited. You know, he kept on telling people, because we run a number of cyber physical infrastructures, and he subsequently kept on telling people, you have to see the toys he has in his lab. And he was really, really excited about it. And in the paper, we note that yes, secure by design is a very valuable thing, but when you have long-living systems, like the infrastructures on which we rely, and they change through all sorts of complex formal and informal processes over a period of time, and have lots of legacy and non-legacy systems built in, it is really hard to have that assurance about secure by design. So we need to think about a different paradigm. We need to think about how do we secure what we presume to be an already compromised system. I did expect I would have pushback, but I also, certainly in my sort of closer collaboration with him in recent years, I also learned that he was reflective. He was willing to initially perhaps push back, but then also reconsider what that viewpoint would be. I think certainly, for me, it's often what was perceived as a controversial stance on something, but then him often being correct about it, but also his willingness to actually reconsider and reflect upon it and consider alternative viewpoints would be my memory, and something from which I personally learned a lot. So, on that, I'll stop and hand over to you. Thank you.
So hello, I'm Kevin Fu. I'm a professor from Northeastern University in Boston. And could I borrow somebody's book, Festschrift book, for just a moment, if you don't mind? Thank you so much. I was told not to bring slides, so I brought slides. And if I can find I wanted to give you a little quote. So I think I first met Ross 28 years ago, I believe, at a DIMAX workshop in New Jersey. And I believe Marcus was there. Marcus, are you? Oh, yeah, okay, sorry. It really changed my thinking. I was a student at MIT at the time. And on the topic of policy, this relates to policy because I recently finished my term in the US government as the acting director of medical device cybersecurity for the US Food and Drug Administration. Because I did research on pacemaker security and things, and in reference to the HealthSec, I started HealthSec, I think it was 15 years ago, but yes. We kind of disappeared for a decade.
Yes. We're back.
We're back. Thank you for restarting it. It was really Ross that got me into that, and it's in the FDA, it's now a $1.5 billion annual marketplace of medical device approvals and clearances.
That was last week.
Just last week, yeah. But it was in, I believe, 1997. I was in the audience, and Ross brought up some transparencies. I believe there were transparencies written on the screen, if my memory serves me correct. And although my vision has gotten much worse, I will see if I can locate this quote. Oh yeah, here we go. I used to take detailed notes in my paper notebook, and I had written down in 1997, Ross Anderson continued his talk on medical network security in the UK. Anderson explains that the most attacks in his medical record security experience come from the inside. And then during our last dinner, Marcus Kuhn and I discussed at length problems and solutions. The reasoning made sense to me after a glass of wine. That's all I remember. Ross was much more focused, I believe, on the privacy side of clinical information security, which is a big challenge, but it, of course, led to the complementary components of integrity and authenticity and high availability. Today, we have seen instances where ransomware has brought down the private cloud of a medical device manufacturer for radiation oncology. Those of you who studied the Therac 25 in the 1990s might recall these kinds of issues. And today it's causing real patient harm when devices are not available to deliver care because of security risks. These are no longer theoretical, no longer kids in the basement. These are real risks. And hope to talk about that more in the panel. And I'll just say, I'll end with I'll just use this one slide because there's too many. But I'm an amateur photographer. I was still learning how to do photography at the time. This was from Financial Cryptography, and Shireen, I believe that's you. We were in Financial Cryptography. We got marooned in Barbados, and Sven was the program chair. You were somewhere out there. And so we were joking we should hold the event in Barbados since everyone got marooned when the airplane went out of business in flight. And when we landed, we said, where do we go? And they said, we don't know. So we all ended up at the same hotel in Barbados. But anyhow, we finally made it to Trinidad and Tobago. And I'll just end with, we were on a snorkeling tour. More conferences should have snorkeling, so I don't know when the snorkeling happens at this event, but hopefully soon. But we were on the boat, and my mask malfunctioned, and Ross, I don't know if he said his mask malfunctioned or he just didn't want to jump in the water. But we had a lovely discussion on security and privacy and such. And so it was just really great to have Ross's mentorship, and that continued. So I think I'll end there to make sure we have time for panel discussion. But yeah, thanks.
Sorry? So we have time for questions. And if there are no questions, then we won't have questions, and we won't have answers. Wait.
Speaking to the mic. Okay, so this is actually a question for you, William, in particular with regards to sort of your discussion on sort of the separation of databases for security purposes versus the kind of, I'm kind of intrigued with the dichotomy between having big databases that give you the statistical analysis, particularly in healthcare, that enable breakthroughs and identification of illnesses and patterns, etc. You know, how that balance is, how easy is it to balance these things?
Like many things in life, there's trade-offs. And with health research, there's amazing, right now big data in healthcare is going toward personalized medicine. So you can input your direct parameters of your body, and you can have specialized care. So that's really the new advent. The problem is, in operationally having a national database. Okay, let's just say 23andMe is out of business, okay? They have a lot of people, that genetic data is not just one person's data, it's their whole generation of data for years to come. So it's fundamentally different, protecting healthcare data is different from, there's similarities with other data, but I'll just use genealogical data in particular. It's much different, and it's not a solved problem, but it's going to be interesting to see what happens with, let's say, the genealogical data with 23andMe, how we're going to solve this problem. So I don't have an answer for you. There's definitely a trade-off. At the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, we get all the claims data for about 25% of the U.S. population, and believe me, the drug companies want that data because they want to market and they want to identify who they can sell their drugs to. And of course, there's other. That's just the most obvious example. So it isn't theoretical. It isn't theoretical. It's actually malicious. The thing I was talking about linkable databases is the easy example I could say is, so we give out data that's anonymized for researchers for your purposes to do research on. So let's just say we give out anonymized data, and then let's just say one of the records says this person came in at 11 or 12:38 to this hospital, and there's no way, it's isolated case, you can't identify who that patient is. But then let's just say Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Illinois, that's where they could find the data came from Illinois. They found out there's another person in their database that came in at 12:38. They can identify now
who that person was, and it's like the linkability between. So there's actually a market in the United States that's a cautionary tale that I think due to the leadership of Ross Anderson prevented that from happening in the States. Like our data in the United States is sold to insurance companies, credit agencies, employers. So you could think of how that could be misused. So, you know, hopefully we're having a new generation of people attack this problem. I think there's ways to talk about it. That's all I can say intelligently on it. It's a good question.
Who gets the ball next, or the cube next? So then I will end with one story that I forgot to tell you, which is when we were in the middle of bugs in our pockets and we were working desperately, and just when we thought we had the paper done is when Apple came out with child-side scanning and we had to stop and redo the paper to accommodate. But I remember one weekend we were meeting on Fridays and on Zoom, and we met on a Friday, and then Ross said, sorry, I'm not going to be able to work on the paper this weekend. I have an op-ed to get in at the Guardian. And on Sunday afternoon, there was a draft in our mailboxes to criticize. And that was part of working with Ross, both the energy, the enthusiasm, and seeing the world in the many different places he had to touch. And I had wanted to include that story. So with that, we'll end, and you can all go to lunch a little bit early and stand online longer.